There is a particular kind of forgetting that happens to successful cars, and it is different from the forgetting that happens to unsuccessful ones. When a car fails commercially, its obscurity is at least logically consistent. It sold few. Few people drove it. Few people remember it. But when a car sells in genuine volume, accumulates a loyal following across 2 decades of production, earns a reputation for reliability that carries it into the garages of police forces and professional firms and county councils across Britain, and then disappears from the public memory as completely as if it had never existed. That requires a different kind of explanation. The Humber Hawk sold, depending on which body of production data you accept, in the region of 160,000 examples across the post-war period of its production life. That is a number that, in any rational account of British automotive history, ought to guarantee a place in the popular memory. It is more than twice the production run of the TR7. It is comfortably ahead of most of the cars that occupy the space in the classic car world's imagination that the Hawk does not. By the measure of units sold, the Humber Hawk was a significant British car. You will not often hear it described that way, and the reason you will not, the specific institutional reason, rooted in decisions made by people whose names are well known from a different direction in British industrial history, is something that the Hawk story cannot be properly told without. It is not a reason that reflects well on the people who made those decisions. We will get to it. But first, what the Hawk actually was, who bought it, why they were right to trust it, and what it tells us about a segment of the British car market in the 1950s and 60s that has been almost entirely written out of the popular account. To understand the Humber Hawk, you need to understand the Roots Group, because the Hawk's position within the Roots range was central to everything about it, its specification, its price, its intended buyer, and ultimately its fate. The Roots brothers, William and Reginald, had built their business from a motor dealership in Maidstone into one of Britain's major vehicle manufacturers across the 1920s and 30s, acquiring Humber, Hillman, Sunbeam, Talbot, and Singer along the way. By the post-war period, the Roots Group operated from its principal manufacturing centre at Ryton-on-Dunsmore, near Coventry, producing a range of vehicles that was organised with a clarity that some of its British competitors struggled to match. The Hillman Minx was the volume product, the car that kept the factories running and paid for everything else. The Humber range sat above it, not sports cars, not luxury in the continental sense, but quality family transport at a price point that the professional classes, the senior civil servant, the successful solicitor, the regional business owner, could justify without embarrassment. Within the Humber range itself, the hierarchy was clear. At the top sat the Super Snipe and, in its time, the imperial large, 6-cylinder cars of genuine dignity that Roots sold to buyers who might otherwise have considered a Rover or a Wolseley. Below these, and accounting for the majority of Humber production, sat the Hawk. It used a 4-cylinder engine, where the Super Snipe used a 6. It was slightly smaller, slightly less lavishly equipped, and considerably more affordable. It was the Humber for people who wanted a Humber without needing to spend quite as much as a Super Snipe required. That positioning was neither accidental nor apologetic. The Hawk's buyer was a specific person, someone for whom the car represented a considered purchase at the top of what they could reasonably afford, or a deliberate statement of occupying a social position that the Hillman Minx, however good a car it was on its own terms, did not quite convey. In the social geography of Britain in the 1950s, the difference between arriving in a Hillman and arriving in a Humber was not invisible. The Hawk existed precisely in that difference, and it sold to a generation of buyers for whom that difference was a legitimate consideration. The post-war Hawk's development proceeded through a series of iterations, Series 1 through to Series 4 and beyond, with periodic revisions to the body, the engine, and the interior that tracked the market's expectations without ever departing from the car's fundamental character. The 2.267cc 4-cylinder engine that powered the later Hawk series produced, in the specifications of the mid to late 1950s, an output that period road tests consistently placed in the context of relaxed, refined progress rather than sporting performance. The Hawk was not a fast car by any measure its buyers were applying. It was a smooth car, A quiet car, a car that made a long journey feel shorter than its specification warranted, and that started reliably on winter mornings, in a way that its buyers, who were driving to offices and courts and consulting rooms and could not afford to be late, specifically required. The automatic transmission option that became available on the Hawk through the mid-1950s placed it in company that the Hillman range could not reach. An automatic gearbox in a British car in 1956 was not a sign of laziness. It was a sign of money, and of the particular kind of driving life that money enabled. Long distances on the improving road network, journeys that crossed the country rather than merely the town, a relationship with the car that was less about engagement and more about arrival. The Hawk's automatic buyers were telling the world something specific about their circumstances, and the Hawk allowed them to tell it without overstating the case. The case for the Humber Hawk was never made in performance figures, and the car's advertising of the period reflects this, with a consistency that tells you something important about who was making the decisions at Roots and who they understood their customer to be. The Hawk was sold on finish, on refinement, on the assurance of a certain kind of British quality leather upholstery, a well-damped ride, controls that operated with a precision and weight that more modest cars of the period did not attempt. It was sold, in effect, on the experience of being in it, rather than the experience of driving it hard. This was not a failure of ambition. It was an accurate reading of its market. The buyer who chose a Hawk in 1958 was not comparing it against a Jaguar and finding it wanting. They were comparing it against a Hillman and finding it superior, or against a standard Vanguard and finding it more distinguished, or against the previous year's Hawk and concluding that the time had come for a change. The Hawk competed in a segment of the market where the relevant criteria were durability, reliability, interior quality, and the social signal that a medium-large British saloon, in good condition, sent to the world from the driveway. The police forces and local authorities that added Humber Hawks to their fleets were not making a sentimental choice. They were making a procurement choice based on running costs, reliability, and the capacity of the car to function under sustained professional use without the kind of unexpected expenditure that made fleet management difficult. The Hawk's four-cylinder engine, which lacked the performance headline of the Super Snipes 6, had the compensating virtue of simplicity. There was less to go wrong, and what went wrong was more straightforwardly fixable by a fleet mechanic who serviced several different makes and models and could not specialize deeply in any one of them. The Hawk's interior deserves a specific note, because it is one of the elements that period road tests return to most consistently, and that owners of surviving examples cite as one of the car's most immediately striking qualities today. The leather seating, the wood-capped fascia, the attention to the detail of door furniture and window winders and dashboard controls. These were not the touches of a car that considered them optional extras. They were the touches of a car that considered them the point. A buyer, who paid Hawk money in 1958, was paying for a specific experience of quality, and the evidence of the surviving cars is that Roots delivered that experience with a consistency that the price did not obviously require. The body styling that the Hawk wore through its main production life, the three-box saloon proportions, the upright glasshouse, the chrome details applied with the restraint that distinguished British practice from American excess in the same period, aged in a way that the more fashionable cars of the same era frequently did not. A Hawk from the late 1950s does not look dated in the way that an American-influenced British car of the same period often does. It looks instead like a car designed by people who were not chasing fashion because they expected their product to outlast the fashion. In that expectation, they were correct. The Roots Group's independence ended in stages across the 1960s. In the pattern of acquisition that was simultaneously happening to several of Britain's independent motor manufacturers, and that reflected both their genuine vulnerability and the American industry's appetite for European market presence. Chrysler Corporation took a minority stake in the Roots Group in 1964, increased that stake to majority control in 1967, and completed its ownership of the company in 1973. The Humber Hawk's production had already ended by this point, The final Hawk came off the line at Ryton in 1967, in the same year that Chrysler assumed majority control. The timing was not a coincidence. The Hawk was a product of a roots group that had its own identity and its own brand hierarchy, and that identity was precisely what Chrysler's rationalization plans did not intend to sustain. What followed Chrysler's acquisition was a brand rationalization of a thoroughness that, in retrospect, looks less like a coherent commercial strategy and more like the systematic dismantling of everything that had made the Roots range distinctive. The Humber name was retained for a period on rebadged Chrysler products. The Humber scepter continued until 1976 as a variant of the Hillman Hunter, but these were not Humbers in any meaningful sense. They were Chrysler rationalization products wearing a heritage badge, and the market recognized the difference with the indifference that misused heritage tends to generate. The final erasure came when Chrysler sold its European operations to Peugeot in 1978, and Peugeot's Talbot branding was applied to what had previously been Chrysler UK's product range. Hillman disappeared. Singer disappeared. Sunbeam survived briefly on a sporting hatchback before disappearing too. Humber, which had been the prestige mark of the entire Roots range, the car that had carried Lord Nuffield and Winston Churchill and successive generations of the British establishment, simply ceased to exist as a going concern. There was no announcement of significance. There was no obituary in the motoring press proportionate to what was being lost. It stopped, and the space it had occupied in the market was filled by other things. The forgetting that followed was a direct consequence of this institutional erasure. The Hawk had no active manufacturer community behind it, no press office issuing anniversary releases, no corporate heritage department filing its history for public consumption. The Roots Group was gone. Chrysler's European operation was gone. Talbot was gone. The chain of institutional memory that would normally sustain a significant car's public profile had been broken at every link, and the Hawk fell through the gaps with a completeness that its sales figures had given no reason to anticipate. The Humber Hawk that survives in the classic car world today does so on the strength of a community that assembled itself without institutional support, and that has maintained the cars and their history from private resources and private conviction. The Humber Register, which covers the full range of Humber models from the pre-war period to the end of the marque's genuine production, has accumulated a body of technical knowledge and historical documentation that the absence of any corporate archive has made all the more valuable. Surviving Hawks range from unrestored barn finds in varying states of completeness to concours examples that represent significant investment in restoration and that demonstrate what the car looked like when it left Ryton in the condition Roots intended. The unrestored cars are, in many cases, the more historically interesting. The Hawk's construction quality was sufficient that examples which have been carefully preserved rather than cosmetically refreshed carry an authenticity that more thoroughly restored cars sometimes lose. The leather, the woodwork, the carpeting, the detail of the fascia and its instruments, these are elements that a sympathetic original car presents with a directness that a restoration, however skilled, necessarily interprets. The corrosion patterns specific to the Hawk follow the logic of the car's construction and the period's manufacturing practices. The sills and the floors are the primary areas of concern on any serious purchase, along with the inner wing structure and the areas around the boot floor where water ingress over decades has done its characteristically patient work. A pre-purchase inspection by someone familiar with the Hawk's specific vulnerabilities is the difference between acquiring a sound car and acquiring an investment in structural remediation, and the Humber Register's network of knowledgeable members is the most reliable route to that inspection. Values for well-documented examples have been climbing modestly but consistently, driven by the combination of genuine scarcity. The survival rate of a car bought primarily as working transport and used accordingly is never generous, and the gradual reassessment of the post-war British saloon market that the post-war British classic car world has been conducting for the better part of a decade. The Hawk sits in interesting company in this reassessment, alongside the Rover P4, the Armstrong Siddeley, the Riley, and the Wolseley. It represents a segment of British car making that prioritized refinement and durability over performance and fashion, and that produced cars whose quality the passing decades have done more to reveal than to diminish. The estate variant, the Humber Hawk estate, produced across several of the later series, commands a particular premium among buyers who appreciate the rarity of a well-made British estate from the period, and who understand what the combination of Hawk quality and load-carrying practicality represented to its original buyers. These are genuinely uncommon cars, and examples with documented history and sound structure are among the more sought-after Humber variants in the current market. 160,000 buyers across 20 post-war years chose the Humber Hawk. They were, in the main, people who knew what they were doing, careful buyers, making considered decisions about a significant purchase, people whose professional and personal circumstances had taught them to evaluate quality and reliability with a seriousness that the advertising could not fake. They were right about the car. The Hawk was what it claimed to be. It gave them what it promised. And then it was taken away from the public record by a sequence of corporate decisions in which the quality of the product was never once the relevant consideration. The forgetting was not the car's fault. It was the fault of the institutions that succeeded the Roots Group and that treated the names they had acquired as assets to be depreciated rather than as identities to be sustained. Chrysler's rationalization of the Roots range was commercially rational on the terms Chrysler was applying. It was also, from the perspective of British automotive culture, an act of erasure whose consequences are still visible in the way the Hawk is or is not discussed today. What the Hawk deserves now is the straightforward reassessment that its sales figures and its quality have always made available to anyone willing to look. It was not a glamorous car. It did not win rallies or set speed records, or attract the attention of the motoring press in the way that performance cars attract attention. It was, instead, a car that 160,000 people trusted with their daily lives across the most consequential 2 decades of post-war British history, and that discharged that trust with a reliability and quality that the buyers who owned them documented in the loyalty of their repeat purchases and in the length of time they kept their cars. That is a record that does not require a rally win or a celebrity owner to be worth remembering. It requires only that someone tells it accurately. That is what this video has tried to do. Now, I want to hear from you. Was there a Humber Hawk in your family parked on the drive, associated with a particular relative, a car you were aware of at an age before you were old enough to think consciously about cars? Did you own one, or do you own one now? And what is the experience of driving it on a modern road? The Hawk has an ownership community whose collective knowledge of this car is the best archive it has, and the people watching this are part of it. Leave it in the comments. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription are appreciated. Thank you for watching.